folks, and welcome back to the Homestead Skill of the Month Club. My name is Esther Emery, and I'm your Master of Ceremonies for 12 skills in 12 months. We've just begun month 2. The topic is old-fashioned cooking. This is the first week of old-fashioned cooking, and the topic is cooking with ingredients. I'm going to offer some ideas about why I think that's important and what I mean by old-fashioned cooking. And then I'm going to give some general ideas of how to go about cooking with ingredients. We're not going to go in the kitchen today. Then after that, I'm going to link up some examples, including one from our own home, which will go up tomorrow, of our making some country gravy. So why old-fashioned cooking? Why that term? Why did I choose that term to be the skill of the month, month 2? Well, for 2 reasons, and it is quite intentional that I chose those words. One of them is that I am particularly and specifically referring to my mother. My mother, Carla Emery, wrote a book which is now on the shelves under the name The Encyclopedia of Country Living. But when she first wrote it, it was called Old-Fashioned Recipe Book. See, there isn't even a "the" on it. It says Old-Fashioned Recipe Book. And this was my mother's life's work and her great passion. It's a funny thing about being the daughter of an author that you may someday pop around on the internet and discover that someone has written a PhD thesis about your mom. That happened to me. I found a PhD thesis written about her and I read it. It wasn't entirely favorable, but it sure was fascinating. But one thing that PhD candidate wrote in her research about my mom that she found to be a point of interest is that although she's written a cookbook, there aren't what we now consider to be recipes in it. Usually when she's talking about how to make something, it's only a couple of lines, and it implies a lot of shared knowledge about the kitchen. Of course, a lot of that shared knowledge is elsewhere in the book, but she structures it with a sense that you should have some knowledge and some ownership over what you're doing in the kitchen. Well, I'm here to tell you that that was not an accident. My mom really believed in ownership in the kitchen. My mother was not a fan of recipe books as she understood them to be when she started writing this. In fact, if you were to get her talking about it, you might get the idea that modern recipe books, modern to her in the late 60s and 70s, were really the demise of culture as she knew it. I didn't necessarily understand that at the time and didn't understand why that was a big deal to her. But now that I have a perception of history, I'm able to look back and see the cultural trends that she was responding to. Here's how I see it. And let me also put in right here that my understanding of this history is influenced by an author named Shannon Hayes, who wrote a book about reclaiming domesticity called Radical Homemakers, Reclaiming Domesticity from a Consumer Culture. Great book. And she did research. And in her research, her understanding of what has happened in America in the last 100 years, she really drew out how we were both tempted and accepted the temptation to replace creative labor in the kitchen with purchasing power. And so there were 2 sides to that, of course. There are companies that are promoting these time-saving and labor-saving devices, which are going to keep us from having to put our creative labor into the kitchen. And then, of course, there's our impulse to want those time-saving and labor-saving things, these products that are going to help us to not have to cook from scratch. And at that time, there were these recipe pamphlets and then recipe books that were put out by the companies creating these products. So the Osterizer pamphlet, or I can't even think of what all the products are, but the oleo pamphlets, so that people would know how to use these products, because of course, until someone told you that you needed oleo and an Osterizer, no one knew that they needed them or necessarily knew how to use them. So my mother's frustration with recipe books was actually in some ways a frustration with advertising and with companies promoting products which to her were invading on a tradition of self-care and alliance and kinship with the land and self-sufficiency that she found to be harmful. So that is one reason to call month 2 of the Skill of the Month Club old-fashioned cooking, because I particularly want to pass on and share the tradition of my family and my mother and her old-fashioned recipe book. But there's another reason, because when we're talking about cooking and we're talking about eating, we're very quickly going to get to the point where we disagree. We're very quickly going to get to the point where what you're cooking and what I'm cooking seem unfamiliar to one another, or worse, unacceptable. It's very easy for us to look at someone else's plate and say, oh my gosh, you eat that? And because of that, conversations about food can be very fraught and very complicated. So I want to make it clear that what I'm talking about here is a general idea of cooking as opposed to a specific one. I am not teaching you any particular school. I'm not teaching any particular technique. What we're doing right here is trying to recapture a common knowledge of cooking, a common broad knowledge of cooking, and also to fight against what I consider to be a kind of a lie of the elite, which is an issue that we have in our kitchens and in various locations in a consumer culture. The idea that if you're not an expert at something, you shouldn't bother doing it. If you're not an expert at cooking, then you should go ahead and just buy it from the store or buy it from a restaurant, or at the very least do copy work, copying someone else's recipes. If you aren't an expert in cooking, you don't have the authority to mess around in your kitchen and combine flavors and find something that you like. Well, that's exactly what I want to work against, because I think we all have the authority to feed ourselves. I think we all have a great deal of knowledge right inside us and inside our bodies that tell us what kind of food we need, what kind of food we want, and even how to combine those foods. And in order to access that interior knowledge, we need to shake the idea that it's wrong to not be an expert. Now, as I say that, I do want to offer tremendous appreciation for the people who are. Some of you who are listening to this are excellent cooks, master chefs, and I give you nothing but praise and admiration. It really can be a lifelong study to discover how flavors work together and textures, and how to bring out the flavors in food, and how to combine them into a dish that satisfies all different senses. That it really is an art and a science, and I give nothing but respect to the people who are excellent at it. We all just want to encourage each other wherever we're at in that scale, and not accept what's really a lie, that if you're not awesome at this, you shouldn't try. Well, there's enough rousing language about old-fashioned cooking and what good it is for us. So the very first principle we're going to start with is one that I have heard hearsay is what's drilled into people in culinary school, and that is that fat carries flavor. So if you're taking notes, this is the first thing you actually have to write down. Start with the fat. So there are some smell and taste compounds, and of course, taste is very much related to smell. Those things are very combined in our human physiology. Some of the things that trigger taste and smell for us are not released in water. They're only released in oil. And that's why we say that fat carries flavor. So if you want to spread a flavor across a dish, the best way to do that is to start with some oil, get the flavor all mixed into the oil, and then mix the oil with everything else. For example, what I call no recipe soup, and I believe this is a French tradition, a French vegetable soup, but I also think there's something kind of universal in the simplicity of it. I'd be interested to hear how many of you have done something similar. I put olive oil in the bottom of the pan, my soup pan, my stock pot sometimes. I put olive oil in the bottom of the pan. I chop onion and garlic because those are aromatic vegetables that are going to release their smell and taste into that oil. I heat up the onion and garlic in that oil until they're soft. Now at this point I have the soft onion and garlic, but I also have this delicious infused oil. I also would add at this point spices and dried herbs. I would even add my salt at this point, my salt and pepper and dried herbs. I'm going to save fresh herbs for the end because the good thing about fresh herbs is that they're fresh and I don't want to cook them a great deal. So now it seems like I haven't done much, right? I've only combined a few things. There's no food in the pan, but I can put whatever I want into that aromatic oil and it's going to have the flavors that I just put in the pan. So for example, if I were making a vegetable soup, I probably would cut my vegetables and toss them right in the oil a little bit before adding my liquid, before adding my broth to make a finished soup. Then of course, once the broth is added, I still have to cook the vegetables. I still have to boil the vegetables until they're soft. Root vegetables do work for this. We've sort of got the idea that the only thing you can do with squash or potatoes is to puree them and make a pureed soup. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But you can also just chop them up, get that lovely flavored oil taste on them, add a delicious broth, cook it until the vegetables are soft, and you have a simple, no recipe soup meal. Another vegetarian example of some of the same principles, if you have a garden, you may have kale in the winter. If you don't have a garden, but you can forage in the late winter and early spring, you may be starting to get lamb's quarters. So here's a recipe for either kale or lamb's quarters, and some of you will not be surprised. It's the same recipe, okay? So you've got your pan. You get it nice and hot. You put your olive oil in the pan, and of course it could be any other fat, but we're working with olive oil for this particular flavor combination. You thin slice your garlic and you heat your garlic in the oil. You're trying to get the garlic so that it's nice and brown but not burnt. Burnt garlic is bitter. Nobody wants that. And so your garlic is, again, infusing that oil. So you're getting your oil all full of that good garlic taste. Now you have your kale or your lamb's quarters clean and drained and ready to go. You put it all in the pan and you quickly toss it. You're trying to coat every little bit of that greenery with the garlic infused oil. And the reason why is that pretty soon that vegetable is going to start releasing liquid. And at the point that the vegetable starts releasing liquid, it's going to be too late to get that garlic oil on there. So you want to have it on there right away. And then once you do have that garlic all spread around, then you can control the wilting process by adding a little water, turning up the heat, putting a lid on, and really intentionally wilting those greens. And then cooking them to whatever consistency you prefer. And then seeing, when you take that taste, that you've got that garlic flavor. You successfully captured that garlic flavor because you used the fat, the oil, to move it. So now let's talk about meat. So let's say that you're eating out of storage and you have some beef stew meat or elk stew meat, and you want to create a dish with that that's going to be delicious and also use whatever vegetables you happen to have in storage. Where do we start? We start with the fat. Certainly it could be olive oil again, or the fat of your preference. And again, you're going to start with onions and garlic. So again, you cut up some of those aromatic vegetables, heat it up in the oil until your oil smells right, and do use your nose on this because you'll be able to tell what you like. And your body's going to start responding. Somewhere in here, it's going to be like, oh, I like that. And you're going to feel this communication, like the signals are opened up. Channels of communication are opened up. Your body's going to start telling you, that smells good. I want that. Let's do that. And there's going to be a creative impulse there, which is really what so many people have been craving in the kitchen. So once you have that oil all heated up, then probably the next thing to add is the meat. And you're going to want to sear that meat, because if you sear that meat, it's going to give that juice. It's going to seal the meat, but the juices are going to come out. So then you're going to have a sauce happening with the juices that are coming out of your seared meat. And now you can add vegetables, and you're playing the same game we were playing with the vegetarian soup now. So how are the different vegetables going to contribute to that flavor of that broth, which is now has the aromatic oil in it, but also has this meat juice in it? Then at that point you can add a starch if you'd like. If you want to get some rice to soak up that the juices coming from that meat, you'll find that a starch is going to then be a way to expand the volume of the meal and to really fill your belly. This is what I'm talking about when I say cooking from ingredients. This is what my mother was talking about when she said old-fashioned cooking, and this is what we were talking about on Tuesday when we talked about cooking from scratch. My challenge to you is to give it a try this weekend. If you've never tried it and you're a meat eater, this weekend I challenge you to make some gravy, and particularly to make some gravy from a roux. Roux, R-O-U-X, is a great cooking skill to have, and it's so easy. It's so easy. Even I can do it. If I can do it, you can do it. The fact is that as humans, we are meant to be creative. We are creative. We have a great capacity to be creative. And what we're working on this month in old-fashioned cooking is really bringing that creativity, that sense of creativity and joy into our kitchens and making something from scratch. Well, my girls showed up to do the closing with me. This is Stella and this is Sadie, if you don't know them. Oh, let me do my closing. So we're going going to put up a tutorial tomorrow on country gravy. This is a simple way of using a roux to make gravy. If you've never done it before, please do it. It's super easy, and being able to understand the chemistry of how a fat can carry a flavor to change a whole dish may just give you a sense of real empowerment and power in the kitchen to use your own creative labors rather than your purchasing power to get the results you want. If you are a vegetarian, then you probably don't want the country gravy recipe, but we're going to have some other links below, and we're also going to have the YouTube star Fresh Princess is going to be doing a tutorial for us a little bit later on roast vegetables. So thank you all for hanging out with us. I hope that this will encourage you to get some creative labor and creative power going on in the kitchen, and we will be so happy to hear what your results are and how it goes for you. So be sure to let us know what your time is like. So thanks for hanging out with us. This has been the Skill of the Month Club, and I'm Esther Emery. We'll see you next time.